Welcome, internet people. Hi, Lauren, if you're watching this. My name's Kunda. I don't do this very often. I've never really done this type of response video before, but a few days ago, I went and the morning after there was a church fire here in Mi'kma'ki, Nova Scotia. I ended up putting that into a video with some of my thoughts, and not too long later, I saw this video of yours, dozens of Canadian churches vandalized and burned down. I thought there were some important points that you made in it, and I also thought that there was some stuff that you really didn't do justice to. So I thought it'd be a good video to do a response to and hopefully have a constructive whatever ends up happening out of this. So let's start the video.
Hey everyone, if you have been keeping up with my posts the last few days, then you will know churches in Canada are burning right now. Not because it is a damn hot summer there at the moment,
But I feel like it is kind of negligent to just gloss over the fact that it is a record-breakingly hot summer there at the moment. It's a factor.
but by deliberate arson. And I'm not just talking about one or two churches here. There are literally dozens being attacked. I can't even count how many have been targeted. Just last night in Alberta, 10 churches were the target of vandalism. Last week, 4 Catholic churches were burnt to the ground. This is getting insane. But why is this happening? What was the thing that sparked this? Well, if you are not a Canadian, you probably do not know the history of the settlers and the Indigenous in the country. And it is
And even if you are a Canadian, like Lauren almost makes it sound like we're all highly educated on the subject. Our education systems here do not do the greatest job at educating most of us on the subject. I live pretty close to an indigenous community, so I've been fortunate that there's been a fair amount of that in the schools that I go to, because there are a lot of indigenous people that go to the schools that I went to. But I've talked to a lot of people that live in Canada that remember basically nothing of their teaching about the residential schools going through school or being taught about the history between Indigenous and the colonial governments.
a sordid past, quite similar to the history of America and Australia. And one particular thing in Canada that goes highly criticized is our residential school programs.
And this video focuses a lot on the residential schools and then the church burnings, but I feel like there is a little bit. It could have been done better if you, Lauren, would have just gone more into the overall like history that it's not only the residential schools that were very harsh on the indigenous peoples of the continent.
Where essentially children were taken out of Indigenous communities and sent to schools that would teach them to act like the European settlers and basically beat the Indigenous culture out of them. In some cases, quite literally, where kids were both physically and sexually abused. Many people refer to what happened as, at the very least, being a cultural genocide, and I would not disagree. Migrants coming to a new land and forcibly making a native people forget about their own history, customs, and language, and forcing them to change to theirs is absolutely destroying their culture deliberately. This is something
True.
all Canadians are educated on in school, and
Not true. There are a lot of people who do not get sufficient education on that subject, like I said.
for the most part, we all agree was wrong. Now,
Also not true. I was at a service not long ago. Yeah, atheist, pagan, went to a church. Like, may as well enjoy them while we still got them, am I right? But in that service, the lead preacher, I do not know how to correctly pronounce it. It's the word that starts with a D. in a Catholic service was saying that he was framing it like the intentions to go to these indigenous communities, take the kids out of poverty, which didn't happen. A lot of these schools were very impoverished places, probably more impoverished than the indigenous communities that the churches and governments were justifying the existence of these institutions. Like, yeah. I'm getting a little bit fired up because we really aren't adequately taught about this history. A lot of proud Canadians, with all of these, like, we're going to go into the mass graves later in the video, but with the evidence of these mass graves coming out, a lot of proud Canadians are sitting there blinking like, what the fuck, why didn't I know this shit? And Lauren kind of glosses over it as if we're all taught about how terrible it was and we all agree. There are some people who disagree on how terrible it was, and a lot of us aren't taught about it. Oh yeah, back to the service. What they were saying was that the intentions to remove these kids from poverty and to try and assimilate them were good, but the pain that the churches inflicted on these kids and their descendants was very not good. And what I'm saying with that is that the degree to which people in what's called Canada agree on how bad the residential schools varies more than I think it should, and I would think Lauren thinks it should. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Recently, what has resparked this conversation of historical abuse is the discovery of hundreds of unmarked graves using ground radars at former residential and boarding schools in Canada in
And one of the things that I see a lot of people bring up, this isn't a Lauren thing, she doesn't say this in the video, but a lot of people are like, we've known these schools are terrible and heard the stories about how terrible they are for years and decades now. Why is it such big news now? And the reason is because this evidence is coming up with the rediscovery, the recovery of these mass graves. And my understanding is a big part of the reason why that's happening is because this ground penetrating radar technology is fairly new within the last couple decades.
Multiple provinces. And while the country seems completely shocked by this discovery, the truth is
that's the reason it's come back into the cultural consciousness.
Who know this history, this actually was known well before the mass media attention. As noted in the National Post, from the earliest days of the Indian residential school system, the federal government openly acknowledged high rates of student mortality. An official 1907 report into Manitoba Indian residential schools even included charts cataloging pupils as either good, sick, or...
And this is what I'm saying. I'm not excusing the abuse. The abuse is atrocious, and the responsibility of the administrators and the workers of these schools. But this kind of thing here also goes into showing how these schools were also impoverished and not even really justified compared to the conditions they were probably in back at home. Like, going from a debatably impoverished place where they're loved to an impoverished institution where people are fucking abused, I would think the loving environment is obviously the preferable place here.
Or dead. There was never an official policy on how to handle the dead from Indian residential schools, but because the Department of Indian Affairs refused to ship home the bodies of children for cost reasons, it follows that most were buried on or near school ground.
And this is something I didn't know. I think maybe some of my friends or people in my audience might not have known. Thanks, Lauren, for bringing this fact to my attention. Like, I appreciate learning shit, and I didn't know that there was no policy. Like, it's just another example of how badly the government of the past failed, and I would say the government is still failing.
This was confirmed by the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released in 2015. Many, if not most, of the several thousand children who died in residential schools are likely to be buried in unmarked and untended graves, it wrote. This is obviously horrific. I have not seen anyone disagree with that, and it's been a reopening of wounds for the nation to discuss and heal from. The National Post article actually offers some legitimate solutions and ways to make things better, like finding strategies to commemorate, protect, and document these grave sites.
And we're all entitled to our opinions. Lauren's not an Indigenous Canadian person. I'm not an Indigenous person. We're entitled to our opinion. That's not a terrible idea that Lauren just gave. I definitely think that that should happen. I'm not sure it's appropriate for us to be talking about what exactly is the appropriate way for everybody, including the Indigenous people who were subjected to these horrible things, to be healing from.
However, unfortunately, some people have very little interest in healing and actually improving the lives of all Canadians and properly documenting history, and simply want revenge, whether that revenge even makes sense or not.
I think that's a pretty gross oversimplification. I think everybody wants healing, whether you agree with the way that they go about it or not. We need to be having discussions and not shutting each other out. And I'm talking to both sides when I say that. But we shouldn't be mischaracterizing each other either. Again, both sides.
Which brings me to, what does any of this have to do with churches? Well, many of these residential schools were in fact run by churches, whether that be Catholic, Anglican, or otherwise, and overseen by the government as well.
And yeah, let's get into that. When Lauren says many here, let's just cover some of the denominations that ran these schools, and maybe also when they closed. So, this was a Roman Catholic, one closed in the 70s, Roman Catholic, Roman Catholic, Roman Catholic, Methodist, 68, 73, 88, 71, Roman Catholic, Methodist, Anglican, 62, 61, 73, 32, Anglican, United, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, 83, 78, 41, whole bunch of Roman Catholics, Methodist, other. Let's keep going. 1919, 1949, 1970. Little chunk of Anglican, Methodist, Roman Catholic. You getting the point. A whole bunch of others. Non-denominational. Federal Government of the Northwest Territories, I'm gotta assume. GNWT. Like, you see my point here. It's predominantly church-run. Hell of a lot of them Roman Catholic. Probably 50% or more, I would assume. But a good chunk of them Roman Catholic. Also, interestingly, Wikipedia lists them by province. So, Alberta, whole bunch in Alberta. BC, like, whole bunch in BC. Bunch in Manitoba. 5 in Newfoundland. About a half dozen in the Northwest Territories. I've actually heard people talk about there being perhaps one still operating in the Northwest Territories. 1 in Nova Scotia, 2 in Nunavut, Ontario, Quebec, maybe a dozen in Quebec, Saskatchewan, and then Yukon Territory. There were a lot. And my understanding is they've only just started searching these grounds with the ground penetrating radar, so it's going to be interesting to see what else ends up coming out of all this.
Leading people to now blame all churches across Canada, despite the fact that the people who did this aren't even alive anymore, for these graves.
So, looking at the numbers on these articles. Like, some of them were 60s, some of them operated as late as 96. A chunk of them were operating well into the 80s. Like, a lot of us were still alive until these, like, before these schools closed. Like, talking about people mine and Lauren's age here. People older, like, what I'm saying is there are absolutely still alive people who went to these schools, and assuming that the people who worked there and taught there, some of them were almost certainly in their 20s and 30s, it is not a far jump that some of the people who administered and worked at these schools are still alive too. Like, Lauren dismisses it like everybody who was affected by this is all long dead, or everybody who was responsible for this is all long dead, and that's just, it's really, really not the case, Lauren.
Which is possibly the dumbest reaction to this incident imaginably possible. Firstly, many of these churches being burnt down are on indigenous land, meaning the members of the church, the people employed there, the people who run charity work there and are receiving it, the people who go to worship there are likely indigenous.
So would you say that it's not a contentious issue amongst indigenous people how much lingering religious involvement and influence there is in indigenous culture in the modern times? Because I think that's probably pretty contentious.
Themselves, and may even be the descendants of residential school victims. I cannot imagine how burning down their place of worship
May even be the descendants of residential school victims. Almost all indigenous people in Canada that you and I know are related at least to some residential school victims.
Is going to bring them truth and reconciliation. And speaking of truth, if for some reason any of these churches were connected to the residential schools and may have had documents or graves or anything, which people have no idea, they're just arbitrarily attacking Christian churches. But let's say there were a church that did, and they went and burnt that down. They would be destroying evidence. They would be destroying history. They would be destroying people's abilities to properly document and account the stories of those who may have been impacted by the residential school program. It's just stupid.
So, I don't mean to come down overly harsh. Maybe I have been so far in this video. Lauren makes an important point to consider here. Like, churches traditionally, they're full of shit. They house a lot of genealogical stuff. There well could be records and evidence of the crimes that happened in the residential schools in some of these churches that ought not to be burnt with the church, whether or not you think the church should be burnt down. Not to mention the important genealogical and family knowledge that could be contained in there too. Like, that is important stuff to a lot of people, to a lot of indigenous people, as well as to a lot of people with the values that Lauren Southern has. So I would think there should be some shared ground here.
But most importantly,
Like, I don't like the harms that have been caused by Christian colonization. I don't limit that to what's happened on the North American continent. I think Christian colonization basically swept westward across Europe and then westward across North America. But I don't like all the lingering influence that there is both, or I should say the impact that Christianity has had on paganism. Like, paganism in Europe even was all but wiped out. So I have some understanding of the impact of Christianity on indigenous cultures and traditions, not to mention the fact that I just care to listen to how people have been impacted, which is something that most all of us should be doing in Canada. There is a lot of healing that needs to be done, and I'm not trying to tell people how they need to go about doing it. The point that, before I got off on this tangent, I was trying to make was that I'm not about to tell indigenous people and communities that they shouldn't burn their church. I would say that it shouldn't be a spontaneous thing. It should be an agreed upon through community consensus. Get the important shit out of the church. Maybe even dismantle and take some of the other valuable stuff, and then if you want to burn it in symbolism in a safe way, go ahead at that point. How many burning churches need to be symbolically burnt? I don't know. I don't like the waste. Like, the title of this video we're responding to is dozens. Does there need to be many more than that? I'm off on a tangent. Let's keep listening to what Lauren has to say here.
Of all the reasons that could be listed, this is a crime. A crime against people who have done nothing wrong, and more so, a hate crime.
So, the idea that individuals have done nothing wrong, I can get behind that. I'm not going to demonize Christians for being Christians. Like, religious freedom and all that, have your beliefs. Don't try and minimize the impact that the institution which shares your beliefs and in most ways administers your belief has had historically, though.
Destroying the place of worship of a religious group that is now gaining mass hatred in the country from the public for crimes they did not commit. No one is responsible for the crimes of a dead man, or even crimes of their relatives historically before them. No one would...
So the thing is, people want to see this investigated. If people... Some of these churches were still operating, like I said, up until Lauren and I were born and people about our age. So if people went to these schools were administered, some of these people are most likely still alive.
Take it as an acceptable excuse to burn down a mosque in Canada because of a Muslim terror attack. That would be a hate crime. And you would...
She's got a point. Like, there is a double standard there. Like, you cannot deny that the double standard exists. Now, the rationale for the double standard that, as we're going to see, seems to go right over Lauren's head, is that Islam hasn't been the influence in North America, in Canada, that has been damaging communities for centuries now. That's Christianity. I get that people further towards the right are very concerned that Islam may do that exact same thing, and that's a discussion that maybe we should be trying to calm the waters by actually having. But yeah, it was Christianity that had the atrocious actions and committed all of this harm in our communities here, and not anything else, let's say.
Would be arrested for it, rightly so, and it would be international news and the topic of political discussion for weeks in Canada. These church burnings, however, have been going on for weeks now, and I have only just started seeing them in the news somehow. And Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has only commented on them for the first time yesterday. And what about progressive activists? What are they up to in all of this? Are they in an uproar about the destruction of worship sites in a country with freedom of religion? Are they upset about this vandalism and arson? Should we do a check mark check?
Before we do the checkmark check, though, I just want to say that, like, pretty much everything is relative. I'm almost certainly more progressive than Lauren. I'm not trying to wear that as a badge. I'm just trying to say, in some circles, I hang out with progressives, and I end up being the most conservative person in that room. So, all things are relative to where a person is standing themselves. I don't know if I'm progressive to whoever is watching this video. But that said, I am not super happy about this. Like, I don't like that the records might be lost. I don't like that people's religious freedom is being infringed on. I think as long as we have freedom of speech to criticize religion, there isn't all that much harm in religious freedom, and that conflict should be going on in the arena of speech. Like, Lauren almost paints this like every single person left of her is rejoicing about this, and that's not exactly the case here.
Oh, there we go. If I wake up tomorrow and the news is reporting that every Catholic church in Canada was mysteriously burned to the ground, I wouldn't be upset. Hashtag residential schools. Yep, that's about right. Normal blue check behavior there. Seriously. Imagine if people behaved this way reacting to any other community in Canada. If mosques started burning to the ground across the country, or say, if native heritage sites started burning to the ground across the country and we had verified accounts encouraging it and cheering it on, there would be a whole commission. The entire country would go into an uproar about extremism. And yes, you know what?
And I'm not saying you can't find people that are rejoicing about these churches being burned, but that's not everybody in a particular community.
Canada does have a problem with extremism. We're seeing it right now, and maybe we do need to deal with it. I'm just not sure politicians are ready to acknowledge the kind of extremism it is, because...
And I'm a little bit concerned with how exactly Lauren might feel is appropriate to try and deal with extremism. Please try and keep me out of the re-education camps. I almost said residential camps.
It's looking like it doesn't quite fit into their neat little narrative. And that's the terrifying thing, is how long is this going to go on for before we recognize this as extremism? Are we going to have to wait until someone is in one of those churches that gets burnt down? Will we have to wait until this escalates into something worse? Now, it is perfectly reasonable to be infuriated with terrorism. It is perfectly reasonable to be infuriated with residential schools, but harming and blaming people who had nothing to do with it is not reasonable. It's criminal. And this is...
People aren't being harmed and blamed, though. A building and a religion is being harmed and blamed. People want the accountability on the people, that, like, the workers and the administrators. That's what we're struggling to get across here. The failure of that to happen is the reason the blame is being taken out on these material objects.
Like, I feel like I'm talking to a kindergarten class, but for some reason, there are people in Canada doing backflips, mental backflips, to try to excuse this. I had one person suggest to me that by lamenting the loss of these churches, I don't have empathy for those found in the graves at residential schools. Like, could you imagine someone burning?
Yeah, that's bullshit. Like, the toxic discourse that's going on between people, like I said, it's toxic. We need to be more understanding. I hate to, like, tone police. That's not what I'm trying to do here. We need to have a thick skin if this is going to happen. But we need to be actually working to understand and communicate with each other and, like, build tighter-knit communities as opposed to just dividing and playing politics and all that kind of bullshit.
Your house down, and when you get upset about it, being told you don't have empathy for the deaths of someone who died at another house at the hands of another person long before you were born. This is absurd. Just insane. And don't...
Long before we were born, 1996 being the last one that closed. Like, that is one of the biggest problems with this video. It perpetuates this "it was all in the past" attitude bullshit.
Don't fall for it. Do not let these people gaslight you into thinking this is okay or justified in any sort of way. If you are a churchgoer in Canada, please contact your local representatives. Get security teams and night crews out around your churches. Install cameras if you have to so we can catch these people. Begin rebuilding if you've lost your place for community and worship. You have a right to your faith. You have a right to worship. That is in the Canadian law. You have a right to not have your building burnt down in your community. And even if you aren't a Christian, even if you aren't religious at all, or you're from a different faith, I would like to think that you still care about this too. I mean, this is a rights issue in Canada. This is a matter of extremism that could very well end up affecting groups other than Christians too. But I don't want to end it like that. I mean, it was just Canada Day. There's still so much beauty out there, and we need, well, we need the truth. We also need less black pills. So I hope you all know, those of you in Canada, I am praying for you. And I know many, many watching this. And
Why is this exactly how the service that I went to this weekend ended as well? Like, it ended with something along the lines of, we're praying for you and you and you and an end to this pandemic and for the First Nations people of this continent. Like, why does this ending feel so similar?
many more will stand up to help save churches there and churches around the world. And I think the reason a lot of us are so angry, I'm so upset, people are getting so fired up about this and everything going on in the world right now, is because there is so much joy and goodness and hope, and it's worth protecting. People love their communities, people love their churches, people love their families, and they don't want to see them go down these dark paths. They don't want to see them lost and burnt to the ground. And
She's touching on an important point. It seems to me like almost everyone is heavily fear motivated and fear driven right now, and that is a huge problem in our culture and in our society. And things are far from perfect. Like, I'm not trying to say that the fears are unreasonable, especially in a lot of these contexts, in a lot of the contexts of the discussions that we're having, but we need to be there for each other, and we need to try and build our communities and our relations so we're more there for each other and more tight knit. And in some ways, these church communities do have a sense of community that is being lost as things get increasingly secularized. Do I like the myths that these communities are built around? No. But I think that's an important thing to acknowledge too. And to start thinking about how we can rebuild community, even as things get increasingly less and less Euro Christian influence, very likely. And I'm hoping we start to do our own thing. Like, Canada has been gradually becoming its own thing for the last 150, 200 years ish. Why is it happening so slowly? Why is there still so much Euro Christian influence? And that's not as to say that I think that influence should just be influence that's imported from other places. I'm saying that we make our own shit.
focus on that. These things are worthwhile. Focus on that and fight for that. Anyways, I love you all. Thank you for staying subscribed. Hit that like button and share this video so your friends who are being completely unreasonable about this issue will hopefully
You heard Lauren. Like and subscribe.
chill out and stand up against extremism. God bless you all. I will see you next time.
So, I'm not really sure how to end this video for my part. Hopefully you found it somewhat valuable. Hopefully you thought that the points that I addressed were important things to address. And yeah, like she said, like and subscribe, comment, feel free to have dialogues and discussions down there. And I hope you all have an awesome weekend, rest of your week, whenever you happen to be watching this.